Okay, so I thought what I would do today is talk a little bit about my background for just a quick moment and then explain why this topic is so relevant to me. I have over 40 years as a librarian. And this is my seventh library job, or seventh library, library, and I've worked around many places around the U.S. In that time, I've had over 10 bosses. I know I've had far more than that people who my boss reported to. So I've had a lot of different people there. And I've worked in the corporate, the vendor, and the academic environment. So I've had a lot of different experiences. And I want to make a disclaimer, this is not about my current job. I have told my boss that as I was working this service, so I'm not writing about you. So a number of years ago, I had got a really good job offer at this place in Boston. And I had heard that a friend of mine, a woman named Liz, had started there. This was in the days before Facebook, cell phones, and all this connectedness. And so I had worked with Liz in Atlanta, but I hadn't seen Liz in a very long time. So my first day of work, I go up there, I walk into Liz's office and say, Liz, it's so wonderful to see you. Liz looks at me, walks over, closes her door, and says, there's something really, really wrong here. And that's when I have sort of my OMG moment thinking, I've sold my house, I've started a new job, I'm under contract to buy a house here, and you're telling me there's something wrong? And she was right. There were way too many top priorities. I had no idea how to focus what I needed to do. There was a lot of management and decision in that environment, and problems that management should be solving were pushed down to line librarians and department heads. And they had a number of long-standing problems they just kind of dumped in my lap and said, here, make it work. I left after 18 months. And I ended up in a really good place for a while. And then I left there when they had some financial changes. Ended up in a second bad job. Essentially where I think the librarians thought as the associate university librarian that I could be a really good buffer between them and the university librarian. And that did not work. The other thing just I want to tie into this is I had a friend named Jean who I worked with, and she left the place we were working together, ended up also in a bad job. So based on that, Jean and I have been talking some, and we end up writing an article about the middle manager's dilemma of working for a university librarian, working for we're writing for the academic environment, but it's applicable to the public library environment, of working for a boss that you really can't work with. As part of our research, we came across a woman named Michelle McQuaid, and she found that nearly 2/3 of workers in the United States would prefer a new boss instead of a raise. That's very telling. And she also notes that 75% of the workforce reports that their immediate supervisor is the most stressful part of their job. I thought it'd be good, kind of a little Dilbert boss here. I don't have I do have a quote down there. I got it from Wikipedia, but I'm sure that's not the original source, clearly. But I want to know, how many of you had a bad boss? Is it never had one? When did you discover it? Immediately, the first week, first month, 6 months, longer? I can tell you all of mine were immediately the first week when I figured out that things were bad. So I'm just curious to see what people say.
Yeah, so we can give it just a couple more seconds for people to log their responses.
So do we have a poll or?
Yep, the poll is running now. We have, oh my gosh, we got 39 out of 45 people voting. So I'm going to go ahead and end it in 3, 2, 1. Okay, and can you all see the results? Scott, can you see the results?
I don't see them, but maybe because I've got so much going on.
Okay, so we have one person who said that they have never had a bad boss. So congratulations to that one person. 50% said within the first month. And 23% said within the first week. So those are by far the largest responses.
So it's really telling that it shows up very quickly. Oh, there it is. Now it shows up.
There
now
we go.
Yes, that's pretty fast and pretty amazing. So.
All right.
So I really want to be fair to my place of my previous employer, but I want to start off. So one of the things I discovered there was part of the issues were the university librarian was not in sync with his middle management. They were not working as a team, and it was often very dysfunctional. And right before I got there, they had a hiring freeze, which changed because they had told me, yes, you can hire people, and then it got changed. But to be fair to them, that library, within a few years, became an Association for Research Libraries member, and the dean won the Hugh Atkinson Award for outstanding accomplishments. So, I have to say, what was the problem there? Where was that issue? Because clearly there were a lot of things going on well, but I didn't find it to be a good job. I think there's other things that could clearly happen here. There could always be like a change in the city or the university's priorities. There could be a new board of directors, a new president, a new mayor, any type of thing that it really starts to impact what happens. Budget changes. You could have incompatible styles. However, you could also have a boss that's truly incompetent. You could have one that lacks the skills and the training to do their job. They might be very insecure and threatened by you or other people, and they may have unrealistic expectations. That was part of my friend Gene's challenge of ending up in a job where a boss expected a change to be made in just a matter of months, and it was probably something that would have taken years, but they're expecting that. So having been in this situation, I've learned this, and you are probably, for those of you who've had it, you probably feel very emotional. And I encourage people when you're in those situations to be very cautious. You see the two little people jousting here, and my first major word of caution to people is never, ever, ever go to battle with your management. Do not for a moment believe you're going to win a battle with your management. The chances are most likely you will lose. Because the chances are also there that your boss has already talked to their management and about you as a problem if they really view it there. Other things I encourage people not to do. Do not lash out in public. And don't complain about your management or your organization when you're at meetings around the state or in other places on campus or the city, wherever you might be. Just keep in mind that when you're behaving badly, it's just more evidence to your boss that you are indeed a problem. Also, be very clear that you do what you're asked to do. If you're not, you're undermining your own credibility. Don't complain to your colleagues. They don't want to hear you complain. They don't want to listen to that. They may be dealing with this problem themselves and are just finding their own strategy, or maybe they don't agree with you and you're just becoming a source of annoyance. And I would encourage people to keep in mind, also don't blame your colleagues, because oftentimes this really isn't their fault. They're trying to do their best. And I remind people to think about the fact that if you act out too strongly, if you are being too noisy, you might find yourself getting fired, depending on your work environment. Now, I do want to go on to say, this does not apply to a boss that's doing something illegal or unethical. That's a whole different situation there. However, I also want to point out that even in those situations, when you go forward with something like that, your job is never going to be the same again, particularly unless it's anonymous. Your life is going to be changed once you do that. I mean, I think we've seen plenty of people who testify publicly about stuff. And yes, it's very noble that they've done this, but their lives are forever changed. So I want to move on to ways to move forward and some strategies you can use. And so just out of curiosity, I'd like to run a quick poll here to see who is familiar with Crucial Conversations already. I have taken their workshop, their 5-day workshop. I've read a number of their books. I read their blog, the Crucial Skills blog. I've gone to online and in-person programs they've done, but I am by no means an expert in this. So I want to point that out because I don't want anybody to think I'm there. And I'm not going to cover all 8 of these areas. They actually have 9, but I've sort of summarized it down to 8, just because I don't want to spend that much time today on this area. I want to keep us moving forward. So do we have a response yet, or are the poll's still running?
Yeah, poll's still running. I'll go ahead and shut the poll down in 3, 2, 1. All right.
So about 1/3, 2/3, it looks like, have heard of it. So I was introduced to Crucial Conversations at one of my jobs. And as I said, I have done a lot more exploring on this. And this has got some really good ways for how do you approach what I would call a difficult situation. And it can be applied in family, it can be applied in volunteer work, it can be applied in the work environment. It really just depends on the environment. So one of the first things, I'm going to start with get unstuck. I'm not just going to go in order here around these. Is the first thing to really do is to identify where you're stuck. You know, where is the problem? What is going on? And part of this comes back to understanding, is this like was it a one-time thing that's sticking there? Or is there a pattern behavior? Such a pattern behavior might be an employee who keeps coming into work late. And one day it may be a broken down car, one day maybe oversleeping, one day maybe a sick child. It's still a pattern with coming to work late, and you've got to be able to identify that. And the other part is the relationship, is how does this problem affect your working relationship with your boss or your colleague, whatever it might be. And the people that run this is called Vital Smarts, and part of their statement is that the bottom line is if you don't talk it out, you will act it out, which I think is a really interesting way of looking at that. I want to move on to start with the heart. And this is a really hard thing to think about in these situations. You've got to start with you first. You've really got to understand what is going on with you and how you're reacting to this, and asking yourself, you know, how is this impacting me? How do I feel about this? You also want to ask, what results do you want? What do you really want to happen here? I think sometimes we'll say, well, the outcome I need is this. But as we think about it, oftentimes that's not what we really want. We want something slightly different. And oftentimes that's a place to come back and to understand, this is what I really need for this. This is what would make me happy. This is what would move me forward. And I think a lot of times it's because sometimes when people become defensive, it's because they sense in our motives that we have a motive that is not really sincere, not honest. You know, if we're saying, I want to have this conversation with my boss and get rid of her, well, that conversation is not going to go well if that's your inner motive. Your conversation has got to be to improve the relationship. Otherwise, it's not going to go in a very positive direction. I'm going to shift now to make it safe. I think this is also another real important concept to get in these conversations. In making it safe, if you told a partner or someone in your household, we're just spending too much money around here, we're never going to be able to retire, your partner's probably going to say something like, and you think this is my fault, you're blaming me, they're going to attack that. If you take a statement and say, I would like for us to have a conversation about our plans for retirement and how we're going to save for retirement and how much money we want to spend in the meantime to enjoy our lives. When would be a good time to have that conversation with you? That's a very different approach. It's really coming to the same thing, but it's a very different approach because the first one sounds attacking and the second one is much less, it's an indirect way of approaching it, but it's still giving you a way to talk about that. In these conversations, a lot of what you want to do is do things such as contrast, saying like, I would like to have a conversation about how much money we're going to save. I don't want you to feel like I'm saying this is your fault. And you keep going back, I want to do this, I don't want this. So that, once again, it sounds like you're not blaming. And you also want to focus on things like mutual purpose. So in the work environment, like if there's a big budget question, you might say, I would really like for us to come up with a way to talk about the budget that serves our patrons the best, our students the best, the members of the homeless population that use our library, whatever it is your conversation is, having that conversation. I don't want this to become one of those situations where everybody has to feel like they're doing a money grab, so that you're not sort of fighting with each other. I'm going to shift now to master my stories. In this one, you want to look and see how you're reacting and how you're casting people. There's sort of this thing like, if somebody cuts you off on the freeway, you have a tendency to swear at them under our breath, and we're going, maybe they didn't see you. I mean, do we ever consider that they have, we've made them out this horrible person, and maybe they just didn't see us. Maybe they were distracted. Maybe the mother had maybe it's a mother with a small child, and the child starts screaming, and the mother's distracted for a moment. So we want to look at that. We want to watch out for things such as we don't want to make ourselves the victim, or something else. We don't want to cast someone as the villain, and we want to avoid feeling helpless. Acting like that we can't control anything here, because the chances are we can control. Learn to look. This is another one on there. And they use these terms. It's kind of interesting. It's a dialogue I had to learn. But they talk about silence versus violence. So when you're in a conversation with someone, if they become silent, it's probably a good sign that they are no longer feeling safe. They're no longer feeling like you're really interested in talking to them. They've quit. I mean, they may be thinking, but it's also very possible that they're feeling like, I'm under attack here and I'm not going to say a word. The other thing is, the other sort of the reverse end of that is what's called violence. And violence can be where they start attacking, they're yelling, they're getting defensive, they're saying, you always do. I mean, in other words, it becomes an attack. It's not necessarily a physical assault, but it's sort of like a verbal assault where they switch the conversation. Both of those occur when someone is not feeling safe, when they're feeling threatened, when they feel like they don't feel like you have their best interest at heart, or whatever it is, and they're going to move into that mode. And that's a time to stop and say, and go back and say something. Let's go back and talk about what you want, don't want, and say, I feel like, and reflecting on what he says. In other words, you're using some emotional intelligence in that. The final one I'm going to talk on, and I'm not going to go into all of them today, just for the sake of time, is the idea of sharing your facts. In other words, saying, this is what I observed, this is what I have seen, this is what I believe is going on. I sense that this is happening. So you're talking tentatively. You're not saying this is absolutely what's happening. I know this is what's happening, but you're doing that and asking other people to share what they believe. What are they saying? What do they think is happening? Ask them to describe what they believe. So I'm going to move on from that. And this is the slide I think is probably painful sometimes. Sometimes it's time to go. And in these environments, I encourage people to explore their options, to maybe talk with HR, if they are. But I encourage you in this place, don't burn your bridges. It's a small profession. If you tell your boss, take your job, and your boss may know somebody at your next work environment if you move on. Questions I would ask at that point, things like, can you be reassigned to work in a different department? If you've been working in technical service, could you work in public services? Could you go work at a branch library or someplace else? It's very possible your boss might be very supportive of that. Can you relocate to another city? Can you change the direction of your career? If you've been a public librarian, could you be an academic? Could you go work for a vendor? Maybe this is the time to create that home landscaping business you've always wanted to do, or whatever you have. Maybe you could be a stay-home partner, go back to school, even consider retiring if that's at all an option. One thing I would suggest is quitting can oftentimes be much more empowering than being fired. You don't want, because you're controlling the terms of it so much more. Rather, when you're fired, you're basically cleaning out your desk, you're gone now. One more thing to keep in mind here is if you're interviewing elsewhere, don't complain about your organization. Don't complain about your boss. Come up with a nice way of explaining why you're not there, say as a management mismatch, or saying something such as, I felt that the top priority should have been this type of thing, and my management really felt something else should be our top priorities, and I really decided I need to go somewhere else and work. The other thing I encourage people to do in this environment, and I know I need to do this myself, is to do the things to take care of yourself. You're under stress, so getting plenty of sleep, eating healthy, exercise, doing things like practice mindfulness. This might be a good time to talk to someone who will listen to you. And this is someone who will just let you vent, let you go on and say, I can't believe, my management, can't believe this person did. I mean, that's the perfect time to do that. And just let you vent. And I also encourage people to watch for depression, because that can happen when you're really under a lot of stress. So this quote has really resonated with me. throughout times when I have ended up in bad jobs and then gone into a good job and back to where I'm saying, gee, they actually do appreciate me. They do think that I'm good. And one of my jobs, one of my bosses said to me, you're the right person for this job. This has been wonderful. And I'm thinking, thank you, because I had left a job where I didn't feel that way. And having a manager that clearly believes that is really wonderful. So the final, well, not the final, but one of the latter slides I have is what I'm calling the moment of Zen. And I think what oftentimes happens is sometime, maybe 6 months to a year, after your situation has changed, when you're long in the midst of all the stress and the crisis and things have started to get better, or they are a lot better, I think it's good to reflect back on what happened, to look back and try to understand your role. In those environments, you probably were not operating at your best. When we're under stress, we probably don't do well. We don't necessarily do our best work. We're not always thinking clearly, or we may not always be as professional, as polite as we would like to be. This is a good time to maybe have another conversation with a colleague. And I say a colleague could be a minister, it could be a professional counselor, who just whatever works for a rabbi, whoever works for you in your environment. And this time it's good to have someone who will be honest with you and not just someone who say, yeah, that was awful, but to help you think and ask you those hard questions to help you really sort of tunnel down onto what happened and what you learned. And I also think you need to recognize it was probably a difficult situation. It may not have been changeable. There may have been nothing you could do, and that you did your best, and the situation still just stuck. And finally, excuse me, I need to get a drink. You need to let it go. You need to move on and just say, I have moved on. I no longer work there. I no longer care. Because if you don't find a way to move on, eventually it will poison you. It will just eat at you for the longest time. And when you have quit thinking about it, when you quit talking about it, you have finally started to really heal from there. So I started with my friend Liz. I like to circle back to Liz. In the midst of that really bad job, my friend Liz looked at me one day and said this to me, basically, do not let a bad job situation make you doubt your abilities. And that really resonated with me at that time, because I really need to hear that, because I thought, I've been effective before. I was doing a good job in my last job. Why is this one bombing? I don't understand. I can't figure this out. Why am I not effective here? And I said the same thing to my friend Jean. And I was saying things to her like, Jean, I've seen how you work with other people. I've seen the way you can pull people from multiple libraries together and get them to work together on projects and talk to one another. I've seen that you're a respectful communicator. So I was reminding her, don't let a bad job situation make you doubt your abilities. I mentioned earlier that Jean had written an article. This is the article. It appeared in the Llama Journal. You can go find it there. You can also find it in both Jean's and my institution repositories, so that you can read more on this if you're interested in that. I don't go into crucial conversations in that particular article, but we talked about some other stuff there, and you can see some of the sources we looked at. And from there, and with that, I am going to go over to the attendee questions submitted in advance.
Yeah, so hi everyone, this is Mary again. I just wanted to say thank you, Scott, first of all, for sharing all of that insight with us. This is a tough conversation to have sometimes. It is really, really hard to separate your emotions as a person from your experience in the workplace. And I'm seeing some comments in the chat around that too. And that's why I think it's really challenging to have those conversations. It's really challenging to not come into them really emotionally charged. And I think it's difficult too, you know, especially once you start having, you have a family, you have a house that you would need to sell, right? Then the idea of relocating becomes really scary too. So there's a lot to think about. And I think kind of my takeaways, Scott, listening to you, you know, I really like the point about having honest conversation, going in with good intentions to have honest conversations. And I think that's probably my best advice about working with people that you don't see eye to eye with. Is going in and starting. I try to start from a place of questioning, right? So I might go in and say to my boss, okay, you know, I noticed that, you know, we disagreed about this, or we had a different approach about that. Can you tell me what you were hoping to accomplish? Or can you tell me how I missed the mark on this so that we can maybe readjust going forward? So I've found going in from a place of questioning is a really positive, at least kind of the best way to help control the emotions around that. I think the advice to not burn bridges is really, really good. This is such a small world and a lot of people know each other. So as angry as you may be, and rightfully so, trying to maintain civility as much as possible is really important. And then I think the best advice that I've learned too is literally document everything. I have a wonderful boss right now, and I take notes in every single meeting that we have. I go in with a Google Doc and I just sit there and I type while we talk. And that always helps us. We can go back weeks later and be like, oh, what did we decide we were going to do about XYZ? And we have the notes to refer back to. So having some kind of concrete documentation about things that you agree to, projects that you're working on, who's doing what, that type of stuff is just really, really helpful for clarifying any like disagreements or things that come up down the road. So those are just some things that came to me while you were talking, Scott.
Yeah. I would add to that because I remember when I left one of my jobs and I was not doing well with my boss, but she gave me a good reference when my new employer called for reference. They said, she gave you a good reference. So
yeah,
it
right.
talks about not burning those bridges because she did that for me.
Yeah, right. And sometimes, yeah, it came up in the chat window, are we talking about like professional ideas? Or are we talking about personal differences? And those can be really hard to parse out. But sometimes it is. The two people just don't connect. So I did want to, so we had sent around a Google form for people to submit some questions in advance. So Scott and I wanted to take maybe 15 minutes or so to take apart some of those questions together. And then we wanted to revisit the chat window. I know we've been collecting some really good questions there too. So we're going to try to hit a little bit of everything today. The first question we got, so I'm going to read this. My boss makes assumptions and listens to gossip about me, then treats them like facts. There are no follow-up conversations with me to triangulate the information. I don't know what to do to make it stop. She seems unwilling to see me as anything other than a problem employee. Help. So Scott, what would you say to that?
I think I'd go back to some of the crucial conversation skills and ask her for a time to talk with her. I'm going to say her, maybe a woman. And to start with that conversation, it says, I think I would ask some questions saying, it feels like to me that that I'm not being heard here, and I'd like an opportunity to talk to you about what I see is going on, or what, really not to blame, but to see what I'm trying to accomplish or what I think is most important. And maybe I'm missing the mark. I mean, once again, I would take it back. So maybe I'm misunderstanding what it is you're asking me to do. But that's where I would start, from a position of trying, kind of like what you were saying earlier, Mary, about, asking questions and trying to understand what is being perceived as going on.
Yeah, exactly.
What would you add to that, Mary?
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. I would say something very similar. And I would say too, I think this is really a situation where it just clarifies the need to try to be as unemotional as possible, right? Because something like this is going to make you it's going to make you go into a meeting feeling defensive, feeling hurt, feeling mistrusted. And it's a very vulnerable position to be in. And especially if you're going into a meeting with somebody that you don't have a high level of trust with in general, so being able to control your emotions in these conversations is really important. I found it really helpful to kind of jot down bullet points before I go into a meeting that I know is going to be difficult, so that I can kind of stay focused and say, okay, these are the points that I want to try to make, or the questions that I want to have answered, and that can help to control the emotional height of the conversation. Yeah,
and I think, as you said, when your boss says, "Well, I understand you're always doing this," you've got to take a breath for a moment, and rather than reacting to that, to take a pause and counter back and offer a different perspective. But as Mary was saying, to be sort of dispassionate, to not get, because it is easy, it's really tough to not get angry and not say, that's not true, I don't do that. You mean asking a question like, can you give me examples of how it seems like I'm doing that? Or why is it going on?
Yeah, exactly. And I think asking for those specific examples can be really illuminating too, for sure. And I know we'll get to the chat window later, but I just saw something that Caitlin asking, crucial conversations only work when both people are prepared to have a truly genuine conversation. What if your boss isn't able to do that? And Caitlin, absolutely. I mean, this is when it starts getting really hard, right? When you have to really step up your emotional IQ in some ways. And I think that's where, first of all, where the documentation comes in, right? You're just sitting there taking notes in your meeting. This is what we talked about. This is what I said. This is what my boss said, right? So you're always making sure that you're covered, that you're doing everything you possibly can to address this productively, and that you're doing everything you can to identify the things that are being asked of you and performing them to the best of your abilities, right? So there's going to be a lot that you can't control about your boss and the environment there, but then there is a lot that you can control. So at that point, I would say focus on the things that you can control.
Yeah, I think the other thing is, is getting really good. And if you have a bad boss, it's hard, but getting really good at reading your boss and understanding how he works, how she works, understanding what there are. I've gotten really good at watching, like I know how I'm watching my current boss, and I know exactly when he wants to speak up and say something. And I know when I need to shut up. It says, did you want to add something to this? I'm watching him. I'm not just staring at him like, I'm not glaring at him, but I'm watching his body language and being very in tune to when something is going on with him. I can sit, because when I sit in his senior leadership meetings, and I can tell when somebody is going on and on. I'm just shut up and listen to him. I can just see this man ready to talk. I'm thinking, you need to be quiet. Let him talk.
Oh, absolutely. That is so much part of the learning process of trying to figure out what resonates with somebody else, right? So Do you have the type of boss who, wants the detailed spreadsheets to go over when you're looking at something, or do they want, the half-page infographic executive summary, right? What's the best way to give them information? Do they really thrive in kind of like a healthy debate environment, or are they really kind of more, subdued and prefer a more calmer discussion, right? So, there's a lot of that type of learning that goes on that can definitely help make those conversations easier. And it's, I think, really difficult when that's not your natural style or your natural instinct.
I would think another thing that fits in that is, depending on what's going on there, is if your boss is feeling frustrated with something because they don't know how to do something, even just asking, says, would you like me to take a stab at this and send it to you for your consideration? In other words, if you can figure out that they're stuck somewhere because something is not their strength, and if you could do it for them.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Absolutely. I remember when I was an early librarian, somebody, I was asking somebody who had been at my school a lot longer, I said, what advice do you have for people who are kind of just starting out? And he said, make yourself as useful as possible. And I don't think he meant do whatever people ask you to do, right? But be useful, right? Offer up things, offer to help, see what sticks, see what you can offer that people might take you up on. And I think that type of action can go a long way towards setting a tone of like, I really want to work with you. I really want to help you. What can we do together to make that happen? So looking at the next question, I thought this was interesting too. My boss knows nothing about the day-to-day work in my job, yet she insists she knows the best way to do things. She doesn't ask or understand why our workflow is set up the way it is, and she doesn't seem to care. Her ideas are usually unworkable, given our staffing and budget levels. How do I deal with her?
Are you waiting for me?
I am, yeah.
I think I might start a conversation and just say something along the lines, could you tell me more about your thinking in this workflow? Could you help me understand, help me understand what you think, why you think these are the best approaches, so that I can understand them better. And letting your boss talk about that for a while, and then offer says. And you might say, well, the challenge I run into with this, and so you can say, I want to try to do it this way. The challenge I'm running into is this. And do you have a thought? We used to do it this way, and this would require us to do this and this and this. Is this what you want us to do?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's exactly what I would say. I would try to document, right? What exactly went wrong and where did it fall apart, right? So, it's much easier to come to her with facts and say, we did not have enough people on the desk, and when someone had to take a break, right, we were left with this problem, right? So, if you have that documentation, that's very, it's not blaming anybody, right? It's just the facts. This happened and it didn't work. Could we think about a way to make it better? That might be one way to approach it.
I think Mary's very right there. One of the most important things in all these situations is to talk about the problem, not about the people. Because when you go into the people, it gets so much easier to get defensive or to blame somebody or make it sound like somebody's being blamed, as opposed to, as Mary just described, well, when somebody had to take their break or when someone needed to leave for the day, we end up with this problem.
Yeah. All right. Here's another one. Here's a situation. Your boss fails to follow through on a promise of a promotion and then denies that the promise was made and does not acknowledge the conversations that had happened leading up to the promise when you confront them about the situation. How do you cope and manage your relationship with your boss who has broken a promise and will not take ownership of their actions that led up to the expectations that they now deny making?
Do you want the flip answer? My flip answer is that's why I'm in my current job. My boss promised me a promotion, and it became very clear. I mean, that wasn't the only issue, but that became one of the things that was very clearly not going to happen when I came back to it. And I got, well, you know how the budgets are, and the university does it. And I'm thinking, yes, but you promoted this other person, and they were not even on your list, but you promoted them. And you'd promised me a long time ago. So, and life isn't fair, sometimes. And that is one reason. That was one of the factors of my at some point deciding to leave. And I wasn't miserable in my last job. I mean, I don't want people to think I was just miserable, but there were just a variety of things that I was saying. Why doesn't she, or she should have done this, or I thought this was going to happen. So going back to, I guess, the other side is, I don't know there's much you can do about that. Because then it comes down, it sort of becomes a battle. You say, well, no, I wrote it down this day. You told me this. If they're denying they ever said that, there's not much you can do. Unless you want to try to go for promotion, say, well, what would it take for me to get a promotion? To bring it back and say, what are the things that I would do? And then at that point, I might do something like a email that says, thanks for the conversation today. I appreciate your telling me that the top 3 things I need to focus on to get a promotion are this, and I will begin working on those.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that documentation is critical, right? So if you had that documentation from the meeting, on this day, I'm looking back at our notes, I saw we talked about this being a possibility, right? When you have that documentation, it becomes a lot more difficult for people to say that it never happened. My guess reading this scenario is maybe the boss really wanted to make it happen, but wasn't able to. And there's probably some embarrassment there, or something changed behind the scenes that the person doesn't know about. But clearly there's, this boss is communicating very poorly. So as much as possible, is there a way that you as the employee can help have one of those crucial conversations with your boss? Can you ask questions? And I love Scott's idea, right? Can you say, okay, what would it take for me to get promoted? Do you see a path forward for me at this organization, right? And kind of lead those difficult conversations that the boss is kind of skirting around right now. So here's one more, and this is kind of a two-parter, and I don't think I'll read the whole thing, but I think a couple questions came in that essentially revolve around when your boss is doing something sketchy or illegal or otherwise ill-advised. One question was related to a boss who was exhibiting discriminatory behavior and was not being called on it. And one question was related to a public library director who was hoarding money, not spending all of their budget, despite having more than enough money coming in from donations and charities and foundations. So those are they're two kind of different issues, but I think they all relate to, your boss is doing something that's either ill-advised, right, not making good use of public funds, or possibly outright illegal, which is discrimination. And how do you address that from a place where this is the person who supervises me and ultimately has control over my employment? What do you think, Scott?
So the one about the money is the easier conversation in many ways, because that's a conversation to be able to go to the boss and ask them about their budget strategies and says, help me understand what your budget strategies are. And if they're not, like, I think part of the question was apparently they're not spending all the money and that's creating problems, and that there's some fear that the money might get taken away. Is that part of that question there?
Yeah. Yep.
And ask them that question, says, are you not concerned that in the future we might, lose money, or we might have money get taken away? Sometimes in those environments, those problems solve themselves, because if they don't do the budget well, eventually they may not be there. Somebody may remove somebody like that from office, because that's a easier problem to deal with. Budget incompetence is not, that's pretty much facts. It's a really clear-cut thing. So, you've been under budget, you've not been doing certain projects you're supposed to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think a lot of that comes down to, how does that directly impact your work in terms of the conversations that you have with your boss, right? If it directly impacts your ability to do something, then that should become your line of initiating that conversation, right? You want to kind of, it can be hard, especially in a smaller library, to stay in your lane in a sense, but you don't want to try to fight battles that you can't really fight. So focusing on how those ill-advised behaviors affect you directly can lead to those conversations. And then starting with questions, there's always the possibility that your boss might know something that you don't. And, you have to allow room for that, which can be a difficult thing sometimes, especially if all you see is one side of it. So starting with those questions can sometimes lead to more answers.
Right. The other one I think is trickier, because discrimination it's harder to prove. I think we all sort of say we know it when we see it, but it's harder sort of to prove factually in saying that somebody is discriminating. They've been there 42 years. Maybe you can hope that you can hold on for a couple more years and they'll retire. I mean, if it's been 42 years, the person's probably in their 60s. Are they going to work that much longer? You could always try out. Somebody could always try an anonymous whistleblower complaint. I don't know. If that's an option. As I said earlier, if you go public with something like this, if you personally go forward, you may win and you may lose at the same time that you win. That's a horrible thing to say, but I think that's in some ways also true.
That's absolutely true. And Ginger from the Twitter chat copied in, check your reporting options. She did say, prepare for disappointment and cover your ass though. And which is true. And I think that's a really tough thing, because there are so many different layers of the bureaucracy. I think if people are observing actual illegal behavior or discriminatory practices, the number one thing you can do is document. When you do document, right, you're documenting specific actions that you observed. You really want to make sure your documentation doesn't have a lot of emotional elaboration, right? You're just saying, I observed this happened on this day and time, right? And with that documentation, it makes it a lot easier to submit a clear report, either via whistleblower channel or by going to HR. One thing I learned that kind of blew my mind as a young employee, HR is not there for you. HR is there to keep your organization from getting sued, essentially. So if you go into conversations with HR from that perspective, I think that can help you frame those conversations as well. Some people don't have HR, and then you would need to figure out who handles your personnel issues. So yeah. Okay, so those are just a few of the questions we had submitted in advance that Scott and I just thought would be interesting to talk through. We wanted to go now to questions from people who are actually here also. So I know I haven't been reading all of the stuff in the chat window. Nyama, would you like to pick maybe one or two questions that you would like to highlight to open up for discussion? Oh, and Nayama's also saying to CYA, cover your ass via personal email when you make those reports too. If you're unexpectedly let go, they may disable your work email and you
Yes.
can't access your files. And these are the really ugly types of conversations to be having. The fact that we even have to think about this. Okay, so Scott Nayama offers the question, can you speak to the emotional labor of orienting yourself to your boss's moods and preferences? I'm sorry, I'm not laughing because it's a funny question. I'm just laughing because this question it's a really good question. Can you speak to the emotional labor of orienting yourself to your boss's moods and preferences?
So I think this starts going back into things such as the emotional intelligence and things on that lines. And yes, it can be hard work. And I think the more you practice it, the more you do it, the more comfortable it becomes, and the more skilled you become at it. And yes, I've worked with some moody bosses, and sometimes I duck. You know,
Right.
not currently. I'll say again, not currently. I don't. I don't. You know. But you become very nimble. As I said, I'm very good at. Just an example. This is not quite the same thing, but listen, I was doing a presentation to our president one day, and I said, "Well, blah blah." Mentioning another school does, and he cut me off and said, "Oh, we don't want to be like them. They're not creative at all." And I thought, next paragraph. I mean, I just immediately switched gears. Just even though I had all these things I wanted to share about why they have some things that we don't have, he did not very clearly envision them as where he wanted to go.
Mm-hmm.
And I very quickly let it go and moved on to my next set of points and just said, and didn't even let him know that I was moving on. I just said, okay, and went right on to something else. I mean, I think that's part of course, see, I'm in management, so I'm used to adapting to this. I've done it for so long.
Yeah, and I would compare the emotional labor of essentially managing up, right? Managing your
Yes.
boss to the emotional labor of coming to work every day in an environment where you feel, like you don't know how to work with this person, right? Like coming in and not having a good relationship with your boss can be a really, really stressful experience. So, I think you have to look at your available reserves and think, okay, like, I can invest the emotional labor in trying, and, no guarantee that it'll be successful, but trying to build something around a workable path with this person, or I can invest the emotional labor in coming in and feeling really discouraged every day. And which is not to say that you might still not be discouraged after trying to work with your boss, but either way, you're expending energy in this situation.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, is that, sort of like that old expression, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take.
Yeah, right.
If you don't invest that emotional energy in trying to manage up, then you're going to wait. Then you're going to expend emotional energy in being upset and disappointed with what happens.
Yep. And then kind of similar to that too, there was another question that Nayama posted about what happens if the problem is broader and there is true dysfunction in leadership? What happens when the entire organization is having difficulty with the boss? So, it's not just a one-on-one thing at that point, right? It's everybody is having difficulty with the boss. What would you say in that situation?
I think, so one of the things I guess I oftentimes ask, though, is this person delivering with what the management, what her management wants, his management wants? And once again, I would say if not, sooner or later they're going to be gone. Because most of us who are in senior management, there is no job security that says you'll be the senior director forever. All of them have clauses in them that say, if you're not performing well, you're gone. And my boss joked, because most of my counterparts are deans and they have tenure, and he one day even jokingly said around the table, well, I can't fire you in a view. Then he looked at me and says, well, I can fire you. And I realize he's teasing me. Funny, not because he's not planning to do that. But if the problems are that serious, they're probably aware of it. I would hope. I hope they're not, that the organization is not so blind that they're not hearing stuff is not floating up somewhere through the grapevine through that. If you're in a public environment, perhaps there's probably a board of trustees, a mayor, or something like that. How are the services going downhill? What are the impacts there, so that someone in a position of power is hearing about this and is aware of the fact that there are problems. If it's entirely dysfunctional, you might also, you could go talk to the person, like if it's the mayor or whatever it is, if that's where this position reports, and say, you want to have a very careful conversation, because you don't want to make this out to tear this person apart, but describing what you see as some of the things that aren't happening that need to be happening, and saying we haven't figured out how to help our director do this better. What would you suggest? How would you suggest we help her manage better? How would you suggest we do this?
Right, and that's absolutely where that documentation piece comes in, and sticking to just the facts. I love how you say, what's the impact on the patrons for this? What are the data show, right? Not just an emotional, we hate this person and she's a tyrant, right? Like, what demonstrable impacts are there? And, have we seen numbers going down as a result of it? So you want to think about what type of data would be convincing to people in that situation. I have my kind of going rogue suggestion in this situation would be something like, if everybody's having these same problems, right? I think it's a really exhausting and many times losing battle to try to take it to upper management, whoever that is. Can you work around this person as much as possible? Can you, as a group, maybe the boss hands down the goals or the projects, right? Can you guys then go off and do those goals and projects on your own? Can you essentially leave the boss out of it as much as possible? That might be one survival strategy. All right, so let's see. I'm looking at what Nyama's putting in the chat. We've got a couple suggested resources. A couple of resources for those who do not want to be a bad manager or boss. How did I not see this coming? A new manager's guide to avoiding total disaster. And then the second book is How Higher Ed Leaders Derail, a survival guide for leaders. So those are a couple of recommendations from the chat window. I think, Nyama, are there any other questions that have popped up that you think it would be good? Just got a few more minutes.
I'm just curious, if we cover public library well enough here. I suspect there might be some people out there in the public environment. I have never worked at a public library. I've been on boards and friends groups, but I've never worked in a public library environment. So I know there are some differences.
And luckily, Nyama, who's moderating this chat, she is a public librarian.
Wonderful. Okay.
Yeah, so she's been providing that perspective.
Good.
Oh, this is a good one. How can you spot a bad leader ahead of time? What would you say to that, Scott? This seems like a really good one to end on.
I think it goes. I think when you're I guess it depends on what we're looking at. Are we looking at when you're interviewing them to hire them, potentially as a director, or when you're going to interview? I think one of the things that I like to do, and I tend to ask a number of emotional intelligence, behavioral interviewing questions of people. So one of the questions I'm very inclined to ask people is, what frustrates you most at work and how do you handle that? Or asking someone, tell me about a situation that someone, if you're looking at a director's job, tell me about a situation where one of the people reported to you said something that you really strongly disagreed with. How did you solve that problem? How did you address that problem? That's a good way to see how they would describe that as a boss. And if they said, well, after I scraped them off the floor, you think, okay, I don't want to work here. And if the person is more inclined to say, well, I asked more questions to understand what they were trying to tell me, And if they answer well, then you think this is maybe a person I could work for. But I would ask questions. That's how I would ask questions of them. Or I would do the same thing in an interview of someone and asking them sort of the reverse question of, how would that work? Because it gives you a sense of what they're like. Behavioral interviews and emotional intelligence questions are really, I think, very helpful, more so than, have you ever had experience doing X?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
You don't learn a lot from that.
Yeah, right.
At least I don't think you do.
Absolutely. I would say, it's all about the questions that you ask, and not just asking the boss, but if you have the opportunity to speak to people who work with your potential boss on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
I've asked, what makes it challenging to work with this person? What do you enjoy about working with this person?
Exactly.
People aren't going to come out and tell you the real truth, but you can kind of read between the lines that way and kind of gauge their reactions. So there is really a lot of emotional intelligence that goes into the whole process.
But you could ask them the question you could still ask the question of somebody like that, of saying, how do they handle it when the library got some really disappointing news?
Yeah, that's a great one.
Or when they got some really disappointing news from their management or whatever, how did they handle the situation?
Yeah, that's a great one.
Because that's a direct question. People amazingly are very willing to discuss those types of questions.
Mm-hmm.
They're really willing to describe, saying, well, we all commiserate together, and then we said, okay, we got to go on and do the work anyway. Or, she yelled and screamed at people, and you just think, whatever you might hear.
Absolutely. And Rachel just popped into the chat window. One of my favorite interview questions is, how would your friends describe you? Which I think is great too.
Mm-hmm.
It's really trying to get at some different sides of a person that is more than just, what do you do as a circulation person or something like that? Or what are the 3 main priorities for this person to tackle in the first 6 months is what Nyama provided. Yeah, so I would be really strategic about the types of questions you ask, but also who you ask those questions to.
Yes.
Okay, you guys, it is 3:00. This is fantastic. I'd like to offer a huge thank you to Scott. If you look in the chat window, I put a link there. It says post-webinar evaluation link. This is just something to help us plan, because like we said, this is a monthly series, so this helps us plan how to evolve this series and how to make it really useful. It was our goal to develop a chat series that was free to anybody who wanted to join, whether or not they're an ALA member, a safe place for people to really get some honest answers to some tough questions. So we really do value your open feedback about how we can make this better or how we could serve different needs for people in the library community. So yeah, we just want to thank you all for being here, for taking the time. If you can, please click the link and fill out the evaluation. And I just want to thank everybody. Have a wonderful holiday season. Good luck finishing up for getting everything cleared up for the year.
Well, some libraries don't close. I have some medical libraries that will be open the whole time.
Oh, nice.
So,
nice.
Yeah, well, I mean, patients don't go away. People still go to the hospital. So
exactly.
Doctors are still working. So, yeah, I guess a lot of the public libraries are probably open a good bit too as well. Some of the academics may slow down for a few weeks, but I guess the public libraries are also very open as well.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and then Scott and I will hang out for a minute if anybody has any other questions or wants to chat some more.